The forged deed pressed against Katherine Reed's ankle like a guilty secret as she stepped off the stagecoach into Miles City, Montana, where the summer sun of 1883 baked the dirt streets until they cracked like old leather. She had spent 3 days rehearsing the lies she would tell, memorizing every detail of the fabricated inheritance. But nothing had prepared her for the way her heart would hammer when she saw the land office across the street, or the desperate knowledge that this was her only chance at a life that did not involve marrying the cattle baron back in Denver, who had made it clear he considered her late father's debts transferable to his daughter. The paper in her boot was supposed to be her salvation. A forger in Cheyenne had charged her every penny she had left, promising that the document would pass any scrutiny, that the ink and paper matched perfectly with territorial records from 1879, that the signature of the deceased landowner was indistinguishable from the original. Katherine had wanted to believe him because the alternative was returning to Denver, and a marriage that would feel like a noose tightening around her neck with each passing year. She adjusted the carpetbag in her hand and started across the street, her traveling dress already dusty from the journey. Miles City was smaller than she had expected, a collection of false-fronted buildings and dirt streets that seemed to shimmer in the heat. But it had a land office and a telegraph, and enough distance from Denver that maybe, just maybe, she could disappear into a new life before anyone came looking. The land office was tucked between a general store and a saloon, its wooden sign sun-bleached and splintering. Katherine paused at the door, reaching down to adjust her boot, feeling the sharp fold of the deed against her skin. This was it. Once she walked through that door and presented the paperwork, there would be no turning back. She pushed the door open. Inside, the office was mercifully cooler, though dust motes swirled in the shafts of light coming through the front windows. A clerk sat behind a desk piled with ledgers and maps, his eyeshade slightly askew, but it was the man leaning against the far wall who made Katherine's breath catch. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their days in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His hat hung from one hand, and his boots were scuffed with the kind of wear that came from hard work rather than fashion. When those eyes landed on Katherine, she felt as though he could see straight through her traveling dress, and the lies she carried to the truth folded in her boot. "Help you, miss?" the clerk asked, peering at her over a pair of spectacles. Katherine forced herself to look away from the cowboy and approach the desk. "Yes, I am here about a property. I have inherited land from my uncle and I need to register the deed." "Name, Katherine Reed. The property belonged to James Whitfield." The clerk pulled out a thick ledger and began flipping through pages. Katherine's hands were sweating inside her gloves. She reached down, trying to make the gesture look casual, and pulled the folded deed from her boot. The paper felt like it was burning through her gloves as she placed it on the desk. The clerk unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the text. Katherine could feel her pulse in her throat. Behind her, she was acutely aware of the cowboy still leaning against the wall, though she could not have said why his presence made her so nervous beyond the general terror of her deception being discovered. "This appears to be in order," the clerk said slowly, "though I will need to verify it against our records. Can you come back tomorrow?" Tomorrow. 24 more hours of living with the knowledge that at any moment someone might realize the ink was wrong, the paper was not quite right, the signature was a forgery. Katherine nodded, not trusting her voice. "There is a boarding house down the street," the clerk continued. "Mrs. Henderson runs a clean establishment. Tell her Walter sent you." Katherine managed a thank you and turned to leave. The cowboy was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. His eyes dropped briefly to her boots, then back to her face, and something flickered there that made her stomach drop. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Katherine fled the land office before her legs could give out beneath her. The late afternoon sun was relentless as she made her way down the street, her carpetbag banging against her legs with each step. She found the boarding house exactly where the clerk had said it would be. A two-story building with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle and curtains that had once been white. Mrs. Henderson was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Katherine painfully of her own mother. She showed Katherine to a small room on the second floor that contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. "Supper is at 6, Mrs. Henderson said. "No men in the rooms, no drinking, no loud noise after 10 o'clock. Katherine agreed to all of it and closed the door the moment Mrs. Henderson left. She sat on the bed, still wearing her traveling dress, and tried to breathe normally. The cowboy had looked at her boots. Why would he look at her boots? And that expression on his face, as though he knew something she had hoped to keep hidden. She told herself she was being paranoid. There was no way he could have known about the deed just from looking at her. Yet the image of his eyes, dark and knowing, stayed with her as she unpacked her few belongings and tried to make herself presentable for supper. The dining room was full when Katherine came down at 6 o'clock. She found a seat at the long table next to a woman who introduced herself as Sarah Thompson, a schoolteacher who had been in Miles City for 2 years. Sarah was friendly in an open way that made Katherine feel even more guilty about her deception, asking about where she had come from and what brought her to Montana. Katherine told the lies she had rehearsed. Her uncle had died, leaving her property. She was hoping to make a new start. Sarah nodded sympathetically and began pointing out the other boarders around the table, giving Katherine a running commentary on the social landscape of Miles City. Then the door opened, and the cowboy from the land office walked in. "That is Blake Edwards," Sarah whispered. "He works the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles north of here. Good man, keeps to himself mostly. His family has been in the territory for years." Blake Edwards took a seat directly across from Katherine. Their eyes met, and Katherine felt that same jolt of recognition, the sense that he could see through every lie she had ever told. He nodded politely, said nothing, and turned his attention to his plate when Mrs. Henderson brought out the food. Supper was roasted chicken and potatoes, well cooked and filling, but Katherine barely tasted it. She was too aware of Blake Edwards across from her, the way his hands moved as he ate, the occasional glances he sent in her direction. Sarah kept up a steady stream of conversation about the upcoming church social and the new minister who had arrived last month, and Katherine made appropriate responses while her mind raced. After supper, most of the boarders dispersed to the front porch or their rooms. Katherine started for the stairs, desperate for the privacy to think, but a voice stopped her. "Miss Reed." She turned. Blake Edwards stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking at her with those impossibly perceptive eyes. "Mr. Edwards," she managed, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Perhaps on the porch. It was not really a question. Katherine nodded and followed him outside, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The porch was empty, the other boarders having gone inside as the evening cooled. Blake gestured to a pair of chairs at the far end, away from the windows. They sat. Katherine waited, her hands folded tightly in her lap, preparing herself for the accusation. "I saw the deed you presented at the land office," Blake said quietly. Katherine's throat closed. "I do not know what you mean." "The ink," he continued, as though she had not spoken. "It was wrong, too bright, modern. The paper was right and the signature looked good, but whoever forged it used ink that was not available in 1879. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Katherine gripped the arms of the chair, searching for words, for some explanation that would make this right. None came. "You are going to tell Walter," she whispered. Blake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening street. "No," he finally said. "I am not." Katherine stared at him. "Why not?" He turned to face her fully then, and in the dim light from the windows, she saw something in his expression that was neither judgment nor pity, but something more complicated. "Because I figure a woman does not forge a land deed unless she is desperate. And I have known enough desperation in my life to recognize it in someone else." "You do not know anything about me," Katherine said, but her voice shook. "I know you are running from something. I know you are scared. And I know that whatever drove you to do this was probably worse than the risk you are taking now." He paused. "Am I wrong?" Katherine wanted to lie, to maintain the fiction she had built, but something about the genuine concern in his voice broke through her defenses. "There is a man in Denver," she said haltingly. "A cattle baron named Marcus Sullivan. My father owed him money when he died. Sullivan said the debt passed to me, said I could work it off as his wife." The words tasted bitter. "I ran." Blake nodded slowly. "Sullivan, I have heard the name. He has a reputation. Not a good one, no." Blake was quiet again, his fingers turning his hat in his hands. Then he said something that Katherine never expected. "Marry me." She was certain she had misheard. "What, marry me?" he repeated, looking at her steadily. "A married woman has more legal protection. If Sullivan comes looking, you would be under my name, harder to find. And the land claim would be more solid with a husband to support it." Katherine felt as though the porch was spinning beneath her. "You cannot be serious. You do not know me." "I just admitted to forging a legal document." "I know enough," Blake said. "I know you are in trouble. I know you need help. And I know that sometimes the only way to survive is to make choices that do not make sense to anyone else. But why would you do this? What could you possibly gain from marrying a criminal?" Blake smiled then, a small, sad expression that made him look younger. "My family lost everything in the panic of '73. My father drank himself to death trying to forget it. My mother raised 3 boys on her own, working herself into an early grave to keep us fed. I was 16 when she died, and I have been taking care of my younger brothers ever since." He paused. "I understand desperation, Miss Reed. And I understand that sometimes the law and justice are not the same thing." Katherine's eyes were burning. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of this stranger who was offering her salvation for reasons she could not begin to comprehend. "This is insane." "Probably," Blake agreed. "But it is also practical. You need legal protection and a way to legitimize that land claim. I need—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "What do you need?" Katherine asked. "My brothers are grown now. Thomas is working in Helena, and Samuel just got married and moved to his wife's family ranch in Wyoming. The house where I grew up is empty except for me, and it is starting to feel like a tomb." He met her eyes again. "I need a reason to stay in Montana instead of following my brothers somewhere else. A wife would be a reason. A future would be a reason." The honesty in his words was almost painful. Katherine understood exactly what he meant. The way emptiness could creep into a life until there was nothing left but going through the motions of existence. She had felt that way in Denver, trapped in her father's debts and Sullivan's expectations, watching her life narrow to a single terrible point. "I do not love you," she said, needing him to understand what he was offering to take on. "I do not love you either," Blake replied. "But I like your courage, and I think we could build something honest on a foundation of mutual respect. That is more than a lot of married people start with." Katherine looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the moment to what this decision would mean. He had a good face, she decided. Weathered and honest, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. His hands were calloused from work, and there was a steadiness to him that made her feel impossibly safe. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I need you to understand that I will not be some grateful little wife who exists to serve you. I have opinions. I have plans for that land if the claim goes through. I want to build something of my own." Blake's smile widened. "I would not expect anything less. And we tell each other the truth. About everything. No more lies, no more secrets." "Agreed." Katherine took a deep breath. This was mad. This was absolutely insane. She was about to marry a man she had met 4 hours ago, a man who knew she was a forger and was offering to marry her anyway. But the alternative was going back to Denver and Sullivan, or staying in Miles City alone and hoping no one else noticed the wrong ink on her forged deed. Sometimes the only way to survive was to make choices that did not make sense to anyone else. "Yes," Katherine said. "I will marry you." Blake Edwards stood and extended his hand. Katherine took it, feeling the rough warmth of his palm against hers, and wondered if she had just made the best or worst decision of her life. They were married 3 days later by the Methodist minister, with Sarah Thompson and Walter from the land office as witnesses. Katherine wore a simple dress she bought at the general store, pale blue calico that fit well enough after Mrs. Henderson helped her take in the seams. Blake wore a clean shirt and his best vest, his hair freshly cut and his boots polished. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Katherine repeated her vows in a voice that only shook slightly, and Blake's hand was steady when he slipped a plain gold band onto her finger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Blake leaned down and kissed her cheek, a chaste touch that somehow felt more intimate than anything Katherine had experienced. Afterward, they signed the marriage certificate, and Blake filed it at the land office along with Katherine's deed. Walter looked at the documents, made notes in his ledger, and stamped everything with official approval. Just like that, Katherine Reed became Katherine Edwards, a married woman with a legal claim to 200 acres of Montana land. Blake had arranged for a wagon, and they drove out to the property that afternoon. Katherine sat beside him on the bench seat, acutely aware of the gold band on her finger and the man beside her who was now her husband. They had not discussed where they would live or what the practical arrangements of their marriage would entail, and Katherine felt the weight of those unspoken questions as they left Miles City behind. The land, when they reached it, was more beautiful than Katherine had dared to imagine. It stretched along a creek that ran clear over smooth stones, with cottonwood trees providing shade and grassland rolling away toward distant bluffs. There was no house, just the remains of an old line shack that had partially collapsed, but the land itself was good. Blake pulled the wagon to a stop near the creek and jumped down, then turned to help Katherine. His hands were strong on her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood very close, looking at each other in the afternoon sun. "It is good land," Blake said. "James Whitfield had an eye for it. Shame he died before he could build anything here." Katherine felt a pang of guilt. "Did you know him?" "A little. He was a bachelor, kept to himself mostly. Died in a riding accident about 3 years back. The land has been sitting empty since, waiting for some distant relative to claim it." Blake glanced at her. "Or for someone desperate enough to forge a claim." "The forger in Cheyenne said there were no living relatives," Katherine said quietly. "He said the land would just sit there forever if someone did not take it." Probably true. Whitfield was the last of his line. Blake started walking toward the creek. "The question now is what you want to do with it." Katherine followed him, her mind already racing with possibilities. Cattle maybe, or horses. The grass is good and the water is reliable. She looked at the collapsed line shack. We would need to build a house. Blake asked, turning to look at her. This is my land, Katherine said carefully, but you are my husband. I assume we would live here together. Blake nodded slowly. I have been living in a room at the Triple Bar Ranch. I could keep working there while we build a house here, bring in some steady money. It would take most of the summer to build something livable, but by fall we could have a decent home. You would do that. Help me build this, Katherine. We are married. Your land is my land now, legally speaking. Though I give you my word I will never try to take it from you. He paused. And yes, I would help you build this. That is what partners do, partners. The word settled something in Katherine's chest. This was a business arrangement, a practical solution to mutual problems. But Blake was approaching it with an honor that made her think maybe, just maybe, they could build something real out of this strange beginning. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property, with Blake pointing out where a house would sit best and where they could build corrals for livestock. Katherine found herself watching him as he talked, noticing the way his hands moved when he described something, the way his eyes lit up when he discussed plans for irrigation from the creek. He was a man who understood land and work, and there was something deeply attractive about his competence. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and orange, they sat by the creek and shared the sandwiches Mrs. Henderson had packed for them. Tell me about your brothers, Katherine said. Blake leaned back on his elbows, looking at the water. Thomas is the serious one. He works as a clerk in Helena, probably will end up in politics or law. He always had a head for numbers and rules. He smiled. Samuel is the charmer, could talk a bird out of a tree if he wanted to. His wife, Emma, is a good match for him. She does not let him get away with anything. And you? I am the one who stayed, Blake said simply. Thomas left as soon as he could scrape together train fare. Samuel was always going to follow his heart wherever it led, but I felt like I owed something to the land, to Ma's memory. So I stayed and learned ranching and told myself it was enough. But it was not, Katherine said softly. No, it was not. Blake looked at her. Your turn, tell me about your family. Katherine felt the familiar ache of loss. My mother died when I was 12, influenza. My father never really recovered from it. He made bad business decisions, borrowed money from the wrong people, drank too much. She picked at the grass beside her. I loved him, but I was also angry at him, for giving up, for leaving me with his debts, for not fighting harder. That is fair, Blake said. Is it? He was grieving. Grief does not excuse abandoning your responsibilities, especially when you have a child depending on you. Blake's voice was firm. My father did the same thing, climbed into a bottle and never climbed back out. I loved him too, but I was also angry. Still am, some days. The honesty of it, the way he did not try to soften his feelings or make them more palatable, made Katherine feel less alone with her own complicated emotions. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. We should head back, Blake finally said. It is a 2-hour drive to town, and the road is not good in the dark. They rode back to Miles City in the twilight, the wagon creaking beneath them and the horses setting an easy pace. Katherine found herself leaning slightly against Blake's shoulder, tired from the long day and the emotional weight of everything that had happened. He did not seem to mind, and when the wagon hit a rough patch, his arm went around her shoulders to steady her. At the boarding house, they faced the awkward question of sleeping arrangements. Blake solved it by announcing to Mrs. Henderson that he would be staying at the Triple Bar and coming into town to see his wife on his days off. That is unusual, Mrs. Henderson said, her eyebrows raised. We are an unusual couple, Blake replied with a smile. In the privacy of Catherine's room, they stood facing each other in the lamplight. "I will be back on Sunday," Blake said. "That gives us both a few days to think about how we want to handle this. We can keep separate rooms if you prefer, or I can find other lodgings in town." "What do you want?" Katherine asked. Blake considered the question seriously. "I want us to be honest with each other. I want to build something good on that land, and I want you to feel safe with me always. Everything else we can figure out as we go." Katherine stepped forward and kissed him on the cheek, a mirror of his kiss at their wedding. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing the ink was wrong and marrying me anyway." Blake touched her face gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. "Thank you for saying yes, even though I am probably crazy." After he left, Katherine lay in bed and touched the gold ring on her finger, turning it slowly. She was married. She had land. She had a future that did not involve Marcus Sullivan. And she had a partner who knew the worst thing she had done and had chosen to help her anyway. It was not love, not yet, but it was something. The next few weeks established a pattern. Blake worked at the Triple Bar during the week, and Katherine stayed in town, slowly gathering supplies for the house they would build. She spent her days at the general store, pricing lumber and nails and glass for windows, and her evenings walking the streets of Miles City, learning the rhythms of her new home. Sarah Thompson became a friend, inviting Katherine to the church social and introducing her to the other women in town. Katherine found herself lying less than she expected. She was Katherine Edwards, married to Blake Edwards, planning to build a ranch on her inherited land. All of that was technically true, even if the inheritance was forged and the marriage was a business arrangement. Blake came to town every Sunday, and they would drive out to the property together. He had hired a crew from the Triple Bar to help with the building, and slowly, week by week, a house began to take shape near the creek. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, but Blake built it solidly, with good timber and tight joints. Katherine worked alongside the men, fetching water and holding boards and learning the satisfaction of physical labor. Blake never told her to stay back or suggested the work was too hard for a woman. He simply handed her tasks and expected her to complete them, which she did with a determination that earned respect from the ranch hands. In the evenings, after the workers left, Blake and Katherine would sit by the creek and talk. They told each other stories from their childhoods, shared opinions on everything from politics to the best way to cook beans, and slowly built a foundation of friendship that felt stronger than Katherine had expected. She learned that Blake loved reading but rarely had time for it, that he could play the harmonica but claimed to be terrible at it, and that he had a deep, genuine laugh that made her smile every time she heard it. He learned that Katherine had a quick temper that faded just as quickly, that she could do arithmetic in her head faster than most people could with paper, and that she was afraid of thunderstorms but would never admit it out loud. One Sunday in early August, as they sat watching the sunset paint the partially finished house in golden light, Blake said, "I think we could move in by September." Katherine looked at the structure, at the solid walls and the roof that was almost complete. "It has happened fast. Good crew. And good weather." Blake paused. "Have you thought about what happens when we actually live here together?" It was the question they had been dancing around for weeks. Katherine drew her knees up to her chest. "I have thought about it. I do not have any answers." "We could keep separate rooms," Blake offered. "The loft could be mine and you could have the bedroom downstairs, or the other way around." "That seems complicated for the long term," Katherine said slowly, "and it would look strange to anyone who visits. So what do you want?" Katherine looked at him, at the man who had become her friend and partner over the past weeks. I want honesty. I want to keep building what we have been building, and I think I want to actually be married, not just pretend to be." Blake was very still. "You are saying you want this to be a real marriage." "I am saying I think we could have a real marriage, eventually, if you wanted that too." Katherine felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Unless I am completely misreading everything and you are horrified by the idea." Blake laughed, that deep, genuine sound she had come to love. "Katherine, I am not horrified, I am amazed and grateful. And yes, I want that too." He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. They sat like that as the sun set completely and the stars came out, holding hands and feeling the shift from business arrangement to something more genuine and fragile and full of possibility. In late August, a week before they planned to move into the house, Marcus Sullivan arrived in Miles City. Katherine was at the general store when she saw him through the window, riding down the main street on a black horse that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. Her blood turned to ice. She had known in some distant way that Sullivan might come looking for her, but seeing him here, in the town she had started to think of as safe, made her realize how naive she had been. She ducked behind a shelf, her heart pounding, and watched as Sullivan dismounted in front of the saloon. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome if it were not for the cruelty in his eyes. He looked like exactly what he was, a man used to taking what he wanted and crushing anyone who got in his way. Katherine waited until he went inside the saloon, then ran back to the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson took one look at her face and asked what was wrong. "I need to send a message to my husband," Katherine said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Immediately." Mrs. Henderson did not ask questions. She sent her son to ride out to the Triple Bar, and Katherine paced her room trying to think. Sullivan was here. He had tracked her somehow, despite the marriage and the name change. What would he do when he found out she was married? Would he accept it and leave? Or would he make trouble? Blake arrived 2 hours later, dusty from hard riding. Katherine met him on the porch and told him everything in a rushed whisper. "He is at the saloon," she finished. "Blake, I am sorry. I brought this to your door. I should have been more careful, should have hidden better." Blake put his hands on her shoulders, grounding her. "Katherine, stop. You did nothing wrong. Sullivan is the one who should be apologizing for thinking he could purchase a human being like livestock." He paused. "Does he know you are married?" "I do not think so, not yet." "Then we tell him." Blake's voice was steady. "We walk into that saloon together, you wearing your wedding ring, and we tell Marcus Sullivan that Katherine Reed is dead and Catherine Edwards is very much spoken for." Katherine wanted to argue, to say it was too dangerous, but the calm certainty in Blake's eyes stopped her. He was right. Running had not worked. Hiding had not worked. The only option left was to face Sullivan directly and make it clear that she was no longer available to pay her father's debts. They walked to the saloon together, Katherine's hand tucked into the crook of Blake's arm. The afternoon sun was hot on her back, and she could hear her pulse in her ears, but she kept her head high and her steps steady. The saloon was dim after the bright street, smelling of whiskey and tobacco and unwashed men. Sullivan sat at a corner table with 2 men Katherine did not recognize, probably hired guns. He looked up when Blake and Katherine entered, and his eyes went cold. "Katherine Reed," he said, standing. "You led me on quite a chase." "Catherine Edwards," Blake corrected, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet in the saloon. "My wife." Sullivan's gaze flicked to Blake, assessing. "And who might you be, Blake Edwards?" "I own the Triple Bar ranch north of here, and my wife and I are building a spread on her inherited land." Blake's hand covered Katherine's on his arm. "I am afraid you have made a wasted trip, Mr. Sullivan. Miss Reed is no longer available to settle any alleged debts." "Alleged?" Sullivan's voice was dangerous. Her father owed me $5,000. That is not alleged, that is fact. Then you should have collected from her father while he was alive, Blake said evenly. Debts die with the debtor unless there is a co-signer, which I am quite certain Katherine was not. Sullivan's face darkened. The law says differently in Colorado. This is Montana territory, Blake replied. And even if the law were on your side, which it is not, Katherine is married now. Her assets, such as they are, belong to her husband, meaning me. And I do not acknowledge any debt to you or your business. The two hired guns at Sullivan's table had their hands near their weapons. Katherine felt Blake tense beside her, though his expression remained calm. The entire saloon was watching now, waiting to see if this would turn violent. Sullivan looked at Katherine, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. You think marrying some cowpoke protects you? I have lawyers, girl. I have influence. I can make your life very difficult. Try it, Blake said quietly. And you will find that Montana ranchers protect their own. You might have influence in Denver, but here you are just another bully trying to intimidate a woman. That does not sit well with people in these parts. As if to emphasize his point, several men at the bar turned to face Sullivan's table, their expressions unfriendly. The bartender folded his arms and stared hard at the hired guns. The message was clear. Sullivan was outnumbered and unwelcome. Sullivan saw it too. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Katherine thought he might try to force the issue anyway. Then he sat down hard in his chair and waved a dismissive hand. She is not worth the trouble anyway, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Skinny thing, probably could not even give you decent sons. You are welcome to her, Edwards. Blake's arm went rigid under Katherine's hand, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, he nodded once, said, "Glad we understand each other," and guided Katherine out of the saloon. They did not speak until they were back at the boarding house. In Katherine's room, with the door closed, Blake finally let out a long breath. "Are you all right?" he asked. Katherine surprised herself by laughing, a shaky sound that was half relief and half hysteria. "I think so. I cannot believe that worked. I was certain he would pull a gun or set his men on us or something. He is a bully, but he is not stupid. Starting a gunfight in a strange town with no local support would have ended badly for him." Blake sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "Though I will admit my heart was pounding the entire time." Katherine sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You were amazing. The way you stood up to him, the way you made it clear I was protected. Thank you." Blake turned to look at her, and something in his expression made Katherine's breath catch. "I meant what I said in there. You are my wife. That means something to me. It means I will stand between you and anyone who tries to hurt you, whether that is Marcus Sullivan or the entire Colorado territory." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever stood up for her like that before. Her father had loved her, but he had been too broken by grief to protect anyone, least of all himself. But Blake, this man she had married out of desperation and convenience, was looking at her like she was worth fighting for. "I do not deserve you," she whispered. "That is backwards," Blake said, reaching up to touch her face. "I am the lucky one. You are brilliant and brave and strong enough to forge a land deed and build a new life from nothing. I am just a cowboy who happened to notice the ink was wrong." Katherine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Just a cowboy who saved my life." Blake kissed her then, soft and careful, a question rather than a demand. Katherine answered by kissing him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. It was nothing like the chaste kiss at their wedding or the friendly pecks they had exchanged in passing. This was real and warm and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I did not plan on it, but I am." Katherine felt like her heart might burst. "I am falling in love with you too. It terrifies me." "Me too," Blake admitted, "but it is a good kind of terrified." They sat together in the fading light, holding each other, while outside Miles City continued its evening routines, unaware that two people had just found something rare and precious in the middle of their complicated, imperfect lives. Sullivan left town the next morning, taking his hired guns with him. Blake stayed in Miles City for the rest of the week, sleeping in the hallway outside Catherine's room despite Mrs. Henderson's protests that it was improper. He wanted to be certain Sullivan was truly gone before he left Katherine alone. By the end of the week, it was clear that Sullivan had returned to Denver. Blake received a telegraph from Thomas in Helena confirming that Sullivan had been seen boarding a train east. The threat, at least for now, had passed. With Sullivan gone and the house nearly complete, Blake and Katherine made plans to move to the ranch. Katherine gave notice at the boarding house, and Blake arranged to end his employment at the Triple Bar. They would be on their own, building their own operation from the ground up, and the prospect was both exciting and terrifying. On the last Sunday in August, they moved Katherine's few belongings out to the ranch. The house was finished, with glass in the windows and a door that hung straight on its hinges. Blake had built furniture over the past weeks, simple but sturdy pieces that made the rooms feel like a home rather than just a structure. The bedroom downstairs had a large bed that Blake had commissioned from the carpenter in Miles City. Katherine looked at it and felt her cheeks heat, but Blake simply set her trunk at the foot of it and asked where she wanted her dresses hung. That night, they cooked their first meal together in the house, venison steaks and potatoes that they ate at the table Blake had built. After dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out over their land. "This is real now," Katherine said softly. "This is our life." Blake took her hand. "Are you happy?" Katherine considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she had been desperate and terrified, willing to commit forgery to escape a future that felt like death. Now she sat on a porch she helped build, next to a man she was genuinely falling in love with on land that was legally hers. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was infinitely better than anything she had dared to hope for. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." Blake smiled and kissed her knuckles. "Good, because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." That night, they shared the bed Blake had built, and Katherine learned that real intimacy was nothing like the frightening, transactional thing she had feared it would be with Sullivan. Blake was patient and gentle and attuned to her responses, and when they finally came together fully, Katherine felt like she was discovering a part of herself she had not known existed. Afterward, lying in Blake's arms with the window open to let in the cool night air, Katherine said, "I love you." "I should have said it before, but I love you." Blake tightened his arms around her. "I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes." "Good scared or bad scared?" "Good scared," Blake confirmed. "The kind that means I have something worth losing." Katherine turned in his arms to face him. "You are not going to lose me. I am here and I am staying, and we are going to build something amazing together." Blake kissed her, slow and thorough, and Katherine felt the truth of her words settle into her bones. She was Katherine Edwards, wife and rancher and survivor. The forged deed might have brought her here, but it was love that would keep her. The first year on the ranch was hard work. They bought a small herd of cattle with money Blake had saved and Katherine had earned doing bookkeeping for several businesses in Miles City. The cattle needed constant attention, and there was always work to be done. Fences to mend, irrigation ditches to dig, hay to put up for winter. Katherine learned to ride properly. Not the side-saddle trotting she had done in Denver, but real riding, sitting astride and keeping her seat through rough terrain. Blake taught her to rope and brand, and the 100 other skills necessary for running a ranch. In turn, Katherine managed their books with a precision that impressed Blake, tracking every penny and finding ways to stretch their limited resources. They made friends with their neighbors, including a family named Morrison who had a ranch 10 miles to the west. Jack Morrison was a gruff man in his 50s who had been in Montana since the territorial days, and his wife Martha became a good friend to Katherine. The Morrisons had 3 daughters, all younger than Katherine, and Martha appreciated having another woman nearby who understood the challenges of ranch life. That first winter was brutal. Snow piled up against the house, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the buckets overnight. Blake and Katherine huddled close in bed, sharing warmth, and worked together to keep the cattle alive through the worst storms. One particularly bad night in January, with the wind howling and snow battering the windows, Katherine woke to find Blake sitting up in bed, staring at the wall. "What is wrong?" she asked, touching his shoulder. "Just thinking," Blake said, "about how different this winter is from last year." "How so?" "Last year I was alone, sleeping in a bunkhouse with 10 other men, wondering if this was all there was going to be for the rest of my life." He looked down at her. "This year I am warm in my own house with my wife beside me and my own herd to worry about. It is hard, but it is good hard." "The kind that means something." Katherine kissed his shoulder. "I know what you mean. Last year I was trapped and desperate. This year I am exactly where I want to be." Blake pulled her close, and they fell back asleep to the sound of the wind, safe in the house they had built together. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. The cattle came through winter in good shape, and several of the cows dropped healthy calves. Blake and Katherine worked sunup to sundown, branding and vaccinating and moving the herd to fresh grass. In April, Katherine realized she had missed her monthly courses twice. She said nothing at first, not wanting to get Blake's hopes up, but by May there was no denying it. She was pregnant. She told Blake one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, and then he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile. He swept her up and spun her around, laughing, and Katherine laughed too, relief and happiness flooding through her. "We are having a baby," Blake said, setting her down carefully as though she might break. "Katherine, we are having a baby." "I know," Katherine said, still laughing. "I am the one who is pregnant." Blake put his hands on her still flat stomach, his expression full of wonder. "When?" "Late December, I think, maybe early January." "Winter baby," Blake said. "We will need to make sure we have plenty of supplies laid in, and you cannot work so hard. We should hire someone to help with the heavy labor." Katherine rolled her eyes affectionately. "Blake, I am pregnant, not dying. I can still work." "But you should not have to," Blake argued. "Not when we can afford help." They compromised. Blake hired a young man from Miles City named Peter Grant to help with the ranch work through the summer and fall. Peter was 18, eager to learn and happy to have steady employment. With his help, Katherine was able to ease back on the heaviest physical labor while still staying active and involved in running the ranch. As summer progressed, and Katherine's belly swelled, she found herself thinking often about the choices that had brought her here. The forged deed still existed somewhere in the land office records, a reminder of her desperation and her crime. But it had led to Blake, to this life, to the child growing inside her. She could not regret it, even knowing it had been wrong. One August afternoon, almost exactly a year after Sullivan had confronted them in the saloon, Katherine and Blake were working in the kitchen garden when they saw a rider approaching. Katherine tensed instinctively, but Blake put a calming hand on her back. "It is just Walter from the land office," he said. Walter dismounted and accepted Blake's offer of water. After pleasantries, he said, "I came out here to let you know that the territorial office is doing an audit of all land claims filed in the past 5 years. They will be checking every deed against the original sales records." Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. They would find the forgery and she would lose everything: the land, her reputation, possibly even her freedom. Blake's hand found hers and squeezed. "When will they be doing this audit?" he asked Walter, his voice remarkably calm. "Starting next month. Should reach Miles City by October." Walter looked uncomfortable. "I wanted to give you folks a heads up. There have been a lot of fraudulent claims over the years, and the territorial government is cracking down." After Walter left, Katherine sat down hard on the porch steps, her hands shaking. Blake sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "It is over," Katherine whispered. "They will find out the deed is forged and everything we have built will be gone." Blake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Not necessarily. Blake, you saw the ink yourself. You said it was wrong." "I know what I said, but think about it, Katherine. The land was legitimately Whitfield's. He died without heirs. You have been living on it, improving it, paying taxes on it for over a year. You are married to a respected rancher, and you are pregnant." He turned to face her. "Even if they suspect the deed is forged, it would be nearly impossible to prove at this point. And more importantly, it would create a mess for the territorial office. They would have to invalidate your claim, which means dealing with the improvements we have made, the taxes we have paid, and the fact that you are now Katherine Edwards, not Katherine Reed. So you think they will just let it go?" "I think there is a good chance they will. Especially if we can show continuous occupation and improvement of the land, which we can." Blake squeezed her hand. "We have receipts for every nail and board we bought to build the house. We have tax records. We have neighbors who will testify that we have been here the whole time, building a legitimate ranch." Katherine wanted to believe him, but fear sat like a stone in her chest. "And if you are wrong, then we deal with it," Blake said firmly. "Together. But I do not think I am wrong. The territorial office wants to catch fresh frauds, not unravel complicated year-old claims with married pregnant women involved." Over the next weeks, Blake helped Katherine organize every piece of paper they had related to the ranch. They made careful lists of improvements, gathered receipts, and even got signed statements from the Morrisons and several other neighbors attesting to their occupation of the land. When the auditor arrived in Miles City in October, Blake and Katherine presented him with a stack of documentation that would have impressed a bank. The auditor, a tired-looking man named Johnson, spent 3 days reviewing their paperwork and visiting the ranch to inspect their improvements. On the 3rd day, he sat in their kitchen and accepted Katherine's offer of coffee. "Mr. and Mrs. Edwards," he said, "I will be honest with you. There are some irregularities in your original deed filing." Katherine's heart stopped. Blake's hand found hers under the table. "However," Johnson continued, "you have clearly been in good faith occupation of this land for over a year. You have made substantial improvements totaling well over the value of the original land. You have paid all taxes on time and maintained good relationships with your neighbors. And most importantly, there is no competing claim on this property." He closed his folder and looked at them both. "The purpose of this audit is to prevent fraud and ensure proper land use in the territory. In my judgment, you have met both criteria. I am going to recommend that your claim be validated without further investigation." Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes. Blake let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "Thank you," he said quietly. Johnson nodded. "Build a good life here. This territory needs people like you." After he left, Katherine and Blake held each other in the kitchen, both shaking with relief. The threat that had hung over them since the beginning was finally, truly gone. The land was theirs, legitimately and legally, and no one could take it away. "We did it," Katherine whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Blake corrected. "You had the courage to take a chance to forge a new life in more ways than one. I just had the good sense to fall in love with you." Katherine laughed through her tears and kissed him. "I think we both got lucky." That night, lying in bed with Blake's hand resting on her pregnant belly, Katherine finally felt the last pieces of fear and guilt release their hold on her heart. She had made a choice out of desperation, and that choice had led her here. To love, to security, to a future she could barely believe was real. Their son was born on December 20th during a snowstorm that made the midwife's arrival a close thing. Martha Morrison came with her, bringing supplies in capable hands, and between the two women they helped Katherine through a long, difficult labor. When Blake finally heard his son's first cry, he burst into the bedroom despite Martha's protests about propriety. He knelt beside the bed where Katherine lay exhausted and triumphant, holding a red-faced, squalling baby. "A boy," Katherine said, her voice hoarse. "We have a son." Blake touched the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger, his eyes bright with tears. "He is perfect. You are perfect." "Thank you." They named him James Blake Edwards, James for Katherine's father and Blake for the man who had given Katherine a second chance at life. Little James had dark hair like his father and what Martha swore would be his mother's nose, though Katherine thought all newborns looked like wrinkled potatoes and said so, which made Blake laugh. The first months of James's life were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, but Katherine had never been happier. Blake was a devoted father, walking the floor with James at night when he fussed and singing off-key songs that somehow always soothed the baby. Katherine would watch them together and feel her heart expand with a love she had not known was possible. In the spring, when James was 4 months old and sleeping through the night more often than not, Blake and Katherine finally had a conversation they had been putting off. "We need more land," Blake said one evening after James was asleep. "The herd is growing faster than I expected, and we are going to run out of good grazing by next summer." Katherine had been thinking the same thing. "The section to the north is still unclaimed. It backs up to the bluffs, but the lower part has good grass and water. We could file a claim," Blake said. "A legitimate one this time," Katherine smiled. "All my claims are legitimate now, thank you very much," Blake grinned. "Fair point, but what do you think? Should we expand?" Katherine looked around their home at the life they had built from nothing but determination and love. "Yes," she said. "We should expand. We should build the biggest, best ranch in Montana." "Why not? Why not indeed?" Blake agreed, pulling her close. Over the next 5 years, they did exactly that. They bought the section to the north and later another section to the east. They built a larger barn and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands they hired as the operation grew. Their herd increased from the original 20 head to over 200, and Blake became known throughout the territory as a fair boss and a savvy rancher. Katherine managed the business side with a sharp mind for numbers and an ability to negotiate that surprised cattle buyers who came expecting a typical ranch wife. She also became involved in local politics, advocating for better schools and roads in the Miles City area. When Montana became a state in 1889, Katherine celebrated by hanging an American flag from their porch that was visible from a mile away. They had two more children, a daughter named Rose in 1886, red-haired and fierce from birth, and another son named Samuel in 1889, quieter than his siblings but with a stubborn streak that reminded Katherine of herself. Life was not always easy. They lost cattle to harsh winters and disease, dealt with droughts and floods, and navigated the thousand small crises that came with ranching. But they faced everything together, and Katherine never once regretted the choice she had made that day in 1883 when she stepped off the stagecoach with a forged deed in her boot. Blake's brothers visited often. Thomas came from Helena with his wife and two daughters, and Samuel brought Emma and their four boys from Wyoming. The ranch filled with cousins and laughter during those visits, and Katherine loved watching Blake with his brothers, seeing the bond between them that had survived time and distance. Martha Morrison remained a close friend, and she was the only person besides Blake who knew the full truth about Katherine's past. Katherine told her one afternoon when the women were alone, needing to confess to someone outside her marriage. Martha listened without judgment, then said, "Honey, we all do what we have to do to survive. You did not hurt anyone with that forgery. You just gave yourself a chance at a life. There is no shame in that." Katherine hugged her friend, grateful beyond words for the acceptance. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Blake surprised Katherine with a gift. He presented her with a leather-bound journal, and when she opened it, she saw that the first page contained a copy of their marriage certificate. "I thought you might want to write our story," Blake said. "For the children, so they know how we started." Katherine flipped through the blank pages, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. "I will write it," she said, "but I will wait until I am old and gray so I can include the ending. What if the ending is boring?" Blake teased. "Just two old people sitting on a porch." Katherine pulled him close and kissed him. "That sounds like the perfect ending to me." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. James grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did, while Rose developed a passion for horses that led her to start a small breeding program. Samuel surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for art, and Katherine and Blake supported his dream of attending school in Chicago, even though it meant being apart from him. As Montana grew and changed around them, the Edwards Ranch remained a constant, a place of stability and love. Katherine watched her children grow and her grandchildren arrive, and with each passing year, she felt more certain that the desperate choice she had made in 1883 had been exactly the right one. In 1903, on a warm summer evening, Katherine and Blake sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were both in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray and their hands weathered by decades of work. James and his wife lived in the original house by the creek with their 3 children, while Blake and Katherine had built a smaller home nearby. "You ever think about the deed?" Blake asked, breaking a comfortable silence. About how it all started, Katherine considered the question. The forged deed was long gone, lost in some territorial archive or destroyed years ago. The land was unquestionably theirs now, proved by decades of occupation and documented ownership. But the memory of that desperate act remained. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I think about how scared I was and how certain I was that I would be caught, and I think about how you saw the ink was wrong and married me anyway." Blake took her hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band she still wore. "Best decision I ever made. Even though I was a criminal, you were never a criminal," Blake said firmly. "You were a survivor. There is a difference." Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the Montana sky turn pink and gold. "I love you," she said. "I do not say it enough, but I do. I love you more now than I did when we got married, and I loved you plenty then." "I know," Blake said. "And I love you. I loved you when you stepped off that stagecoach looking determined and terrified. I loved you when you admitted to the forgery. I loved you when you agreed to marry me even though it was crazy. And I love you now, sitting here in the life we built together." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, holding hands and watching their grandchildren chase fireflies in the gathering dark. The house behind them glowed with lamplight, and Katherine could hear the sounds of her family. James talking with his wife, the children laughing, the comfortable domesticity of a home filled with love. This was her legacy, she thought. Not the land, though that mattered. Not even the ranch, successful as it was. Her legacy was the love she had built with Blake, the family they had created, the proof that sometimes desperate choices made in fear could blossom into something beautiful and true. She carried a forged deed folded in her boot, and a cowboy saw the ink was wrong and married her anyway. From that unlikely beginning, they had built a lifetime of love, trust, and partnership that would endure long after they were both gone. And that, Katherine decided, was the best possible ending to any story. Blake and Katherine lived to see their children's children grow, and eventually, their great-grandchildren arrive. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of family. And Blake gave a speech where he told the story of their meeting, carefully edited to leave out the forgery but including the truth that mattered. That he had seen Katherine and known instantly that she was worth taking a chance on. Katherine died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, with Blake holding her hand. Blake followed her 6 months later, unable to imagine a life without his partner. They were buried on the ranch they had built, on a hill overlooking the creek where they had first planned their future together. The land stayed in the family. James's son took over the operation, and his daughter after him, each generation adding their own improvements while honoring the foundation Katherine and Blake had laid. The story of how the ranch began became family legend, told and retold until it took on the sheen of myth. But those who had known Katherine and Blake personally never forgot the truth, that love could grow in the unlikeliest soil, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was take a desperate chance, and that the best partnerships were built not on perfection, but on 2 people choosing each other, again and again, through all the complications and challenges life could throw at them. The forged deed that had started it all was indeed lost to history, crumbled to dust in some forgotten archive. But what it had created endured. A ranch, a family, a love story that proved that sometimes the wrong ink could lead to exactly the right life. And in the end, that was all that mattered.